Um, Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. If you are joining us today, you're stepping into a deep dive that targets a feeling you have almost certainly experienced. It's a feeling that shadows our daily lives, our careers, our relationships, and those quiet, vulnerable moments of reflection when you're just staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning.
Oh, absolutely. It's that ambient dread.
Right, exactly. We are going to explore a core paradox of modern life today. And the paradox is this. If life is materially so much better than it was centuries ago, if we have unprecedented access to food, technology, and just basic physical safety, why do so many of us feel like we are constantly falling behind?
Yeah, why is there this lingering sense that no matter what we do, we simply are not enough?
Exactly. To answer this, we're looking at Alain de Botton's profoundly revealing book, Status Anxiety. Now, the word status, it comes from the Latin statum, which simply means standing. In a narrow sense, it refers to your legal or professional position. But in the broader sense, the sense that keeps you awake at night, it refers to your value and importance in the eyes of the world.
And from that, we get this concept of status anxiety. De Botton defines this as a pernicious worry that we are in danger of failing to conform to the ideals of success laid down by our society, and that we may, as a result, be stripped of dignity and respect. It's the fear of occupying too modest a rung on the ladder or being about to fall to a lower one.
Which is terrifying when you really think about
It
it.
is. And what's fascinating here is that at first glance, we tend to think of status as a purely individual concern. Like, if you feel anxious about your career, you likely frame it as a personal ego problem. You might think you're just overly competitive or dealing with sheer insecurity.
You blame yourself. You think, I just need to go to therapy, I need to meditate more.
Right. But de Botton presents a systemic pivot. He argues that this distress isn't a personal failure at all. Status is not merely psychological. It is deeply embedded in a social system that distributes respect, dignity, and recognition. Because human beings are intensely social creatures who depend heavily on belonging for survival, this external recognition becomes inextricably tied to our internal self-worth.
So it's baked into our biology, but the system exploits it.
Exactly. Status is actually one of the few social currencies that can increase anxiety as societies become richer. Throughout history, societies have developed completely different systems for distributing this status, whether through birth, religion, profession, wealth, or reputation. So, the anxiety you feel isn't just a quirk of your personality. You are reacting exactly the way the system was designed to make you react.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I think we need to figure out what we are actually chasing when we chase status. On the surface, it looks like we just want the things, right? We think we want the corner office, the impressive title, the beautiful house in the right zip code. But what is the underlying currency there? If we strip away the material goods, what is the actual psychological reward we are hunting for?
To understand that, de Botton points us toward the 18th century philosopher Adam Smith. In his work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, from 1759, Smith asks a brilliant and simple question. He says, "What is the purpose of all the toil and bustle of this world? Why do people work so relentlessly?"
Right, because if the goal were just to supply the basic necessities of nature, food, shelter, warmth, the wages of the lowest paid laborer could easily supply those. We do not need to exhaust ourselves, work 80-hour weeks, or climb corporate ladders simply to survive physically.
Precisely. So what is the real goal of all this frantic activity? According to Smith, the goal is to be observed, to be attended to be taken notice of with sympathy and approval. The rich man glories in his riches because they naturally draw the attention of the world. The poor man, conversely, is ashamed of his poverty because it places him out of the sight of mankind.
So we aren't chasing money or titles just to have them sitting in a vacuum. We are chasing the attention and the respect that those symbols buy us. It's not about the luxury car itself. It's about the way the valet looks at you when you pull up in the luxury car.
That is exactly it. It completely reframes the whole rat race. It means we are all just walking around desperately wanting to be noticed, which actually leads into one of the most poignant observations in the text. De Botton argues that every adult life is defined by two great quests for love.
Yes, and only one of those quests is socially acceptable to talk about. The first is the story of our quest for sexual and romantic love. That story is universally celebrated. It is the absolute staple of our music, our literature, our movies. It is completely normal to admit to your friends that you are looking for a partner.
But the second story, the quest for love from the world, is kept fiercely secret. It is almost taboo. If it is mentioned at all, it is usually mocked as the obsession of envious, shallow, or deficient souls. Or we strip it of its emotional weight and discuss it in sterile economic terms as career ambition. But worldly love is very real, and its absence hurts just as much as romantic rejection.
Let's pause on that idea of worldly love, because I think it's so crucial for understanding our own behavior. When we talk about wanting love from the world, we don't mean romantic affection. We mean having your existence registered. To be shown worldly love is to feel that you are an object of concern to the people around you. Your presence is noted when you walk into a room, your views are listened to during a meeting, and your failings are treated with a little bit of indulgence.
That indulgence is key. De Botton uses these two incredibly heavy labels to describe this dynamic: somebodies and nobodies. When you are a somebody, society treats you with a level of grace. People are eager to look at you, to understand your complexities. They give you the benefit of the doubt.
But when you are a nobody, you are treated brusquely. Your unique traits are ignored. You are effectively invisible to the system. You're just a cog or an obstacle in someone else's way.
And this visibility is tied directly to how we maintain our sense of self. It reveals a structural vulnerability in human psychology. We rely on the external world to tell us who we are.
I love the analogy he uses to capture the absolute fragility of that dynamic. He describes the human ego as a leaking balloon. It's such a visceral image. I want you to just imagine your self-conception as this brightly colored balloon keeping you afloat. To remain inflated, to keep you feeling buoyant and capable of moving through the world, it requires the constant helium of external love and respect.
But here's the tragic flaw. The balloon has a leak.
Right. It doesn't hold helium indefinitely. And because it's constantly leaking, it is highly vulnerable to the smallest pinpricks of neglect.
Those pinpricks are the daily micro-interactions of modern life. They are the subtle social cues that signal your standing.
Exactly. Let's say you wake up, you feel great, you've hit your goals for the week, your balloon is fully inflated. You go into the office or log on to a virtual meeting, and a senior colleague greets you distractedly. They look over your shoulder while you're talking. Or you send a thoughtful, detailed email to a group, and the only response you get is a generic thumbs-up emoji from one person while everyone else ignores it.
Or worse, a read receipt with no reply for 3 days.
Oh, that is the ultimate pinprick. The helium escapes immediately. You instantly start to sink. Suddenly you're questioning your competence, your position in the company, your general worth as a human being. There's something profoundly sobering and honestly a bit absurd about how much we are lifted by the passing attentions of others and completely sunk by their disregard.
We are wholly reliant on these external humps of helium because we rely on signs of respect from the world just to feel tolerable to ourselves. Which brings us to a massive historical paradox. If our balloons are constantly deflating today, we have to look at how the atmosphere around us has changed.
Let's talk about that atmosphere, because materially, we're doing great.
Oh, beyond great. Over the past 2,000 years of Western civilization, the material benefits of progress are staggering. We have seen an extraordinary increase in wealth, food supply, scientific knowledge, consumer goods, physical security, and life expectancy. The average citizen today possesses riches, technologies, and possibilities that are far beyond the wildest imaginations of a medieval peasant who tilled unpredictable soil and lived at the constant mercy of the elements.
Yet, this sharp decline in actual physical deprivation has been accompanied by a massive escalation in the fear of deprivation. Modern populations are gripped by a constant low-level anxiety that neither who they are nor what they have is quite enough.
So why is that? If life is objectively mathematically better, why does it feel so much heavier? It comes down to how human beings calculate value. We do not decide what is enough in a vacuum. You don't sit in your climate-controlled home, open a refrigerator full of fresh food, and think, well, a medieval peasant didn't have this, so I'm completely satisfied with my lot in life.
No, of course not. That isn't how the human brain works at all.
Right. We evaluate our standing through reference groups. We compare ourselves to sets of people we believe resemble us. How do we decide what is enough? We look at what the people around us have.
The 18th century philosopher David Hume actually nailed the psychology of this in his treatise on human nature from 1739. He introduced this concept of proximity when it comes to envy. Hume pointed out that a common soldier does not envy his general. The gap is too wide. There's no relation there. The soldier doesn't look at the general's tent and feel bitter.
Exactly. Instead, the common soldier envies his sergeant or his corporal. The eminent writer doesn't envy a terrible hackney scribbler. They envy other authors who closely approach their own standing. We only envy those we feel we are fundamentally equal to. And this is where the modern world sets a devastating trap for you.
Because the expansion of reference groups in modern society is a direct result of material progress in media. Historically, your reference group was the 50 people in your village. Today, it is a globalized network. Let's look at a really tangible example of this proximity trap. Let's say you live in a pleasant, comfortable home. You have a job that pays the bills, you can afford a vacation once a year, and you are generally content.
Sounds like a good life.
It is a great life, until you make the ill-advised decision to attend your 10-year high school reunion. There is no more compelling reference group than the people you went to school with. You shared the same classrooms, the same teachers, the same starting line. You arrive and you discover that a few of your old peers, people you consider your exact equals, are now vastly wealthier.
One sold a tech startup, another is a partner at a law firm.
Right. They live in grand houses, they drive incredible cars, their kids go to elite schools. Instantly, your comfortable life feels entirely inadequate. You return home nursing a violent sense of misfortune. You haven't lost anything materially, your house didn't shrink, your bank account didn't drop. But because the people you consider your equals grew just a little bit taller, you feel entirely diminished.
That psychological mechanism is precisely why the early psychologist William James developed a mathematical equation to explain human self-esteem. He stated that self-esteem equals success divided by pretensions, which we can understand as our expectations.
Wait, so self-esteem is literally just a fraction. Success over expectations.
Yes, that is the literal equation he proposed.
That makes so much sense. So if I just lower my expectations of being a millionaire, my self-esteem actually goes up without me making a single extra dollar.
That is exactly the logic of the equation. Our self-esteem in this world doesn't just depend on what we achieve, it depends entirely on the ratio of our actualities to our supposed potentialities. Every time you raise your expectations of what you should achieve, you increase the danger of humiliation if you fail.
And this explains why the great democratic and consumer revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries were such a double-edged sword.
Yes, they vastly improved the material lot of mankind, but they also tore down the fixed barriers of class. Which sounds like a good thing. We want social mobility. We want people to be able to rise above their stations.
We do, absolutely. But we have to look at the psychological cost of that mobility. The French historian Alexis de Tocqueville observed this exact phenomenon when he toured the young United States in the 1830s. He noted that the innate equality of human beings in this new democratic society meant that, theoretically, everyone could achieve anything. But when inequality is the general rule in a society, as it was for most of human history, the greatest inequalities attract no attention. A peasant doesn't agonize over the king's wealth because the king is viewed as a completely different category of human.
Right. But when everything is more or less level, when everyone is told they are equal, the slightest variation in success is intensely noticed and deeply resented. Tocqueville saw that Americans had much, but their affluence didn't prevent them from suffering whenever they saw someone else with something they lacked.
This boundless expectation led to a strange, severe melancholy in the midst of absolute abundance. It is wild to think that inequality is actually the fuel for envy. When the structural barriers were removed, the prevailing message became, you can be anything. But the dark side of that promise is, if you aren't everything, it's your own fault.
And that brings us to the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who had a radical perspective on this in his discourse on the origin of inequality from 1754. He proposed a thesis that sounds entirely counterintuitive to our modern sensibilities. He argued that being truly wealthy does not require having many things. Rather, wealth is having what one longs for. Wealth is not an absolute number in a bank account. It is relative to desire.
Rousseau pointed out that there are two ways to make someone rich. You can give them more money, or you can curb their desires. Modern advanced societies are incredibly adept at the first partum, producing more wealth, more goods, more technological marvels.
But they are equally adept at continuously whetting our appetites.
Think about the media systems we interact with every single day. Advertising, social media, entertainment. They are all designed to constantly display symbols of prestige. You are scrolling through your phone, and you are bombarded with curated images of vacations you aren't taking, homes you don't own, and lifestyles you aren't living.
So every time we yearn for something we cannot afford, we grow poorer, regardless of how much we actually have. Rousseau contrasted the modern worker, who is kept in a state of perpetual poverty of the mind because their desires always outpace their resources, with the primitive hunter-gatherer.
The radical savage, as he framed it.
Yes. In Rousseau's view, that primitive human was genuinely rich. They lacked for nothing in the world as long as they had a roof over their heads, basic sustenance, and the leisure to play a crude musical instrument. They were rich because they desired nothing more than what they had.
If we zoom out to the systemic level, Rousseau is highlighting how advanced societies appear to make us wealthier, but their structural effect may actually impoverish us psychologically. By fostering unlimited expectations, these systems keep open a permanent gap between what we want and what we can afford, between who we might be and who we really are.
And this brings us to a monumental shift in how society is structured. We transitioned from an aristocratic society to a meritocratic one. In the old aristocratic system, the rigid hierarchy that dominated Western society until the late 18th century status was fixed by bloodlines.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Now, we need to be clear. The aristocratic system was deeply, horribly unjust. Generations of incompetent kings ruled nations, foolish lords mismanaged estates, and brilliant, hardworking peasants were condemned to live and die in the mud. There was no fairness to it.
None whatsoever.
However, as unjust as it was, de Botton points out that it offered one distinct psychological mercy. Failure carried far less personal shame. Your status wasn't your fault. You didn't choose your bloodline. You were not expected to rise above your station, so you didn't spend your life agonizing over why you weren't living in the castle.
Furthermore, in that pre-18th century world, if you were at the bottom of the ladder, society provided you with cultural narratives that offered deep psychological consolation. De Botton highlights 3 specific old stories that comforted the poor. Let's look at them historically, framing them not as modern endorsements, but as the actual mechanisms people used to survive their social reality.
Let's walk through these because it's fascinating how different the mental landscape used to be. The first old story was the idea that the poor are the true creators of wealth. Back in 1015 AD, an abbot named Elfric wrote about how the peasants who woke before dawn to plow the fields were the ones genuinely generating society's resources. The narrative was that the workers at the bottom were the structural pillars of the world, and they deserved immense honor for their physical sacrifice.
The second old story was deeply rooted in the Christian worldview of the time. The story was that earthly status has no moral value. The central figure of the religion, Jesus, was a carpenter. Pontius Pilate was an important, high-status imperial official, yet he was a sinner. The prevailing idea was that a genius could be found sweeping floors, and an imbecile could be running a nation. Your earthly rank was a temporary, arbitrary assignment that did not reflect the eternal state of your soul.
And then there's the third old story, which gained immense traction in the mid-19th century with thinkers like Marx and Engels. The story was that the rich are corrupt and do not deserve their wealth. If you were a haggard laborer working in the brutal factories of Manchester in the 1840s, this story told you that your poverty wasn't a reflection of your worth. You were poor because you were trapped in a monstrous, exploitative economic system. You were poor because you were being robbed by the owners of capital, not because you were lazy.
When you look at those 3 stories together, they form a powerful psychological shield. They told the poor, you are valuable, the divine loves you regardless of your wallet, and the people at the top are basically thieves. That is a highly comforting set of narratives if you are struggling at the bottom of the hierarchy.
But wait, isn't a meritocracy what we actually want? We want the hardest working, smartest people to be the ones who succeed, right? We want a system where talent is rewarded regardless of your last name. How does de Botton argue that this shift toward fairness is actually a bad thing for our anxiety?
It is not that meritocracy is inherently evil. It is that the incentive structure of a meritocracy fundamentally alters how we interpret failure. As the 18th and 19th centuries progressed, the rise of meritocracy introduced 3 anxiety-inducing news stories. These new narratives completely flipped the old ones. The first news story inverted the economic model. Suddenly, the rich are the useful ones. Thinkers like Adam Smith argued that it was the wealthy who, simply by pursuing their own extravagant desires and building enterprises, inadvertently provided employment and resources for everyone else. They were the great fish providing sustenance for the little fish in their wake. The poor were no longer hailed as the noble creators of wealth. They were increasingly viewed as dependents.
Okay, that's a massive shift in how we view the wealthy. What was the second news story?
The second news story claimed that status has moral connotations. Thomas Carlyle began pushing for what he called a real aristocracy based on talent. The hereditary principle was questioned. If we judge a book by its quality, not its author's parentage, why not distribute political and economic roles the same way? This sounds perfectly fair. But a religious interpretation quickly followed. Christian thinkers, particularly in the United States, began to view earthly riches as a sign of spiritual grace. The Reverend Thomas P. Hunt published a bestseller in 1836, claiming it was a moral duty to become rich, and that wealth was a literal reward from God for holiness.
Which means if you are poor, God must be unhappy with you.
Yeah.
That is a terrifying schist.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this leads to the devastating third news story, which is the inescapable shadow of meritocratic logic. Failure is deserved. When you transition to a society that genuinely believes everyone has a fair chance, success becomes a clear signal of competence, energy, and virtue. You earned it. But the corollary is brutal. If the successful merited their success, the failures had to merit their failure.
So if you don't succeed in a modern system, you can't blame your bloodline. And you can't blame the king. You have to look in the mirror. De Botton quotes Michael Young's 1958 book, The Rise of Meritocracy, which really lays bare the cruelty of this system. Young wrote that today, all persons know they have had every chance. So if they are repeatedly labeled a failure, they have to recognize that they have an inferior status, not because they were denied opportunity, as in the past, but because they are actually inferior.
To the physical injury of poverty, modern society added the agonizing psychological insult of shame. It's a double blow. You don't have money, and society tells you it's an accurate reflection of your inner worth.
This shift fundamentally alters all human interaction. When status becomes tied to personal merit, it breeds an environment dominated by what de Botton identifies as the ultimate arbiter of modern anxiety, the snob. Let's talk about the snob, because we all know one, and they're exhausting to be around. If we think about human development, up until a certain age, existence alone is enough to earn us unconditional affection. A toddler can scream, throw a bowl of pasta on the floor, refuse to put on shoes, and a mother will still stroke their hair, comfort them, and love them entirely. We begin life bathed in unconditional love.
But adulthood introduces us to a world dominated by the snob. The snob is a person whose attention and respect are highly rigidly conditional. Their interest in you is strictly dependent on your status.
The novelist William Makepeace Thackeray was highly critical of this dynamic, calling the media of his day engines and propagators of snobbishness, constantly elevating the aristocratic and ignoring the ordinary. And modern media systems amplify this tenfold.
But if we analyze the psychology of the snob, it reveals something quite sad. We don't find confidence. Haughtiness is not the behavior of someone secure in their standing. Snobbery is driven by terror.
It takes a punishing internal impression of their own inferiority for a snob to constantly need to make others feel small. They belittle because they are desperately afraid of being belittled themselves. They're just trying to protect their own leaking balloon. But understanding that doesn't make it any less stressful to navigate an entire society full of them.
And we are forced to navigate this world of conditional love within the incredibly fragile modern workplace. The modern workplace is the epicenter of status anxiety because it is inherently constantly uncertain. We are entirely dependent on elements we cannot control to maintain our standing. De Botton outlines 5 elements of dependence that make our positions so precarious. We should spend some time on these because they perfectly map the architecture of our daily stress.
Let's go through them. The first is our dependence on fickle talent. If our status depends on our achievements, we need talent to achieve. But talent isn't a machine you can just switch on. You can't just press a button to output brilliance. Talent can appear for a time, win you accolades, make you the star of the department, and then unapologetically vanish. We can't always summon our best selves. You might have a creative block or a period of burnout, yet your entire livelihood and status hang on this erratic, unpredictable gift.
The second is dependence on the pyramidal workplace. Most businesses, structurally, are shaped like pyramids. There is a wide base of junior employees and a very narrow tip of management and executives. The fight for promotion is mathematically fierce. There simply aren't enough seats at the top for everyone. And the anxiety-inducing part is that promotion often relies less on actual task performance and more on obscure political skills.
Right. You aren't just doing your job. You could be the best coder or the best accountant in the building, but you're also trying to navigate a labyrinth of office politics where the rules are rarely spoken out loud. You have to figure out who has influence, how to claim credit without looking arrogant, how to manage egos. It's exhausting, and it has very little to do with merit.
The third element is perhaps the most profound structural tension in the modern commercial system: the conflict between the economic imperative and the human imperative.
To put that in plain English for a second, the economic imperative is just the company's bottom line. It's the spreadsheet. It's profit, efficiency, minimizing costs. And the human imperative is us, the people who actually need to pay rent, who desire respect, security, and a sense of belonging.
Exactly. From a purely economic perspective, labor, meaning the employee, is just an input cost. It is a commodity to be optimized. But there is one glaring difference between labor and other commodities, a difference that pure economics struggles to represent. Labor feels pain. If a company decides it is cheaper to use natural gas instead of coal to power a furnace, it makes the switch. The coal does not jump off a cliff in despair. It doesn't worry about how it will feed its children.
But if a company decides your department is redundant to save 3% on operating costs, you react emotionally. Humans sob in toilet cubicles. They drink to ease their fears of underachievement. And de Botton is saying the spreadsheet is always going to win out over our feelings. While a company might care about its employees whenever it faces a serious choice between survival or profit margins and the security of its workers, the economic imperative will always trump the human imperative by the very logic of the commercial system. You are ultimately a means to an end.
Which brings us to the fourth element, dependence on profitability. Even if you navigate the politics, even if your talent is flowing, your status depends on your employer remaining profitable in a brutally competitive market. And the fifth element is dependence on the global economy. A macroeconomic shift, a tariff, or a technological disruption halfway across the world can eliminate your industry overnight, completely erasing your status despite your individual merit.
So if we're living in this hyper-fragile workplace where we're treated as commodities, where our talent is fickle, and the global economy could wipe out our jobs tomorrow, what happens when we inevitably stumble? That's where this really dark, uniquely modern concept comes in. The idea of the loser. We live in a world terrified of failing at these uncertain tasks, compounded by how harshly failure is judged. The word loser is devastating in the modern lexicon. It implies not just that you lost the game, the promotion, the market share, the election, but that you have completely forfeited any right to sympathy.
A loser is deemed unworthy of compassion because, in a pure meritocracy, they supposedly brought their fate upon themselves. The fear of being branded a loser is what keeps us on the treadmill, terrified of slipping.
The irony, of course, is that the rules of this treadmill are entirely made up. When you ask who decides what gets rewarded and you take a historical world tour of status symbols, you quickly realize how completely arbitrary the rules of the game actually are. Oh, this is one of my favorite parts of the whole deep dive. Let's look at what different societies valued.
It really highlights the absurdity. In ancient Sparta, the members of the group who acquired the most status were violent warriors men who bullied the population into respect through sheer physical dominance. In 12th century Europe, the highest status belonged to knights on horseback because physical safety was in short supply and they provided protection.
Or consider the Cubio tribe of the northwestern Amazon from around 1600 to 1960. In that society, if you wanted status, you needed to be a jaguar hunter. The highest rung on the ladder belonged to men who spoke very little, because babbling was thought to sap a warrior's strength. If you killed a jaguar, you wore its teeth on a necklace. The headmen of the tribe wore large jaguar-tooth necklaces and, crucially, armadillo girdles. Meanwhile, men who helped their wives prepare a root-based meal were deeply shamed and lost status.
This raises an important question. What is our modern equivalent of the armadillo girdle? Because we look at that and laugh, but we are doing the exact same thing. If a talent for hunting jaguars or riding a horse in battle no longer earns us the label of success, what does?
De Botton sketches the contemporary Western ideal. Think of hubs like London, New York, or Los Angeles around 2004 when the book was published, and even today. In our current system, the successful person is someone who accumulates money, power, and renown through their own accomplishments in the commercial world. Financial achievement is heavily prized because it is trusted to be meritocratic. The ability to accumulate wealth is taken as absolute proof of at least 4 cardinal virtues: creativity, courage, intelligence, and stamina. Poverty, conversely, is viewed as a moral deficiency. If you own a rusted old car or live in a threadbare home, society implicitly suspects you of lacking drive or character.
Thorstein Veblen captured this perfectly in his 1899 book, The Theory of the Leisure Class. Veblen noted that wealth had become the conventional basis of esteem. It became indispensable to acquire property just to retain one's good name. The very concept of a status symbol, a luxury car, a designer watch, the latest smartphone rests on the assumption that acquiring these expensive goods demands the greatest qualities of character. We look at the person with a yacht and we just assume they must be brilliant and hardworking, while completely ignoring the sheer luck, generational wealth, or systemic advantages that might have actually paid for the boat.
And this is where we must recognize the political nature of status. These ideals, the reverence for the entrepreneur, the worship of the billionaire, are not handed down by God or nature. They are human-made. They date back primarily to the mid-18th century. And because they are human-made, They are subject to change. They are fundamentally political.
Groups are constantly waging political battles, whether through the ballot box, a labor strike, or even a compelling piece of literature, to change society's honor system. They're trying to redirect society's notions of who rightfully deserves the privileges of high status.
This brings us to the profound distortion of priorities that our current system creates. The 19th century art critic and philosopher John Ruskin was incensed by what he saw happening in industrial Britain. He excoriated society for worshiping what he called the goddess of getting on. He believed that modern society affects a gigantic distortion by elevating material accumulation to the highest possible level of human achievement, when it should merely be one of many factors in a well-lived life. We are taught to envy the wrong things. We look at the CEO or the famous actor, and we only see the edited highlights of their careers. The media presents the glamorous results, but it entirely edits out the grueling, monotonous labor, the broken personal relationships, the profound stress required to produce those results. We envy a mirage.
Which leads us directly to the core of this entire analysis, the true crisis in perception. The crisis isn't just that we feel anxious, it's how we interpret that anxiety.
Right. The crisis appears when you interpret your distress, your feeling of falling behind, as a personal moral failure. You look at the hierarchy, you see yourself in the middle or at the bottom, and you internalize it as a definitive judgment on your own soul. What remains completely hidden from your view is the structure itself. You don't see the invisible scaffolding, the comparison systems we discussed, the cultural narratives equating wealth with virtue, the economic incentives that reduce humans to labor inputs. You just blame yourself.
Precisely. The system is designed to make its rules feel like natural laws. When people believe that status perfectly reflects merit, they cannot see the arbitrariness of the game. They cannot see the legacy of the old aristocratic systems or the influence of modern advertising creating unquenchable desires, as Rousseau warned. By shifting your attention from your individual insecurity to the systemic design, the dynamics of status competitions suddenly become visible. You realize how deeply modern identity depends on social recognition, and how that recognition is manipulated by the prevailing political and economic winds.
So what does this all mean? How do we actually live with this knowledge? Because de Botton is clear. We cannot live entirely without status anxiety. Caring what other people think is part of being human. It's part of having ambitions, of wanting to contribute to your community, of loving others. If you completely didn't care what anyone thought of you, you'd be a sociopath. Status anxiety is the price we pay for acknowledging a public distinction between a successful and an unsuccessful life.
But while our need for status is fixed, we retain the power to choose where we fulfill that need. We are at liberty to choose our audience. We do not have to accept the mainstream bourgeois system that measures worth entirely by financial achievement or corporate titles. De Botton points to historical refuges for those who reject the mainstream. He talks about Bohemia, the garrets, the cafes, the subcultures of poets, travelers, and essayists who emerged in the 19th century.
Bohemians created a spiritual rather than a material method of evaluating oneself and others. They proposed that eccentricities, artistic devotion, and fellowship could be worthy of an elevated status of their own. Art, philosophy, even religion offer alternative value systems. You don't have to play the game with the people obsessed with the goddess of getting on. You can find smaller ponds. You can find different species to swim with, communities that value kindness or creativity or civic duty over the accumulation of luxury goods.
It is about recognizing that status is available from and awarded by a variety of different audiences. You must ensure that your worries about being disgraced arise principally in relation to an audience whose methods of judgment you actually understand and respect. If you don't respect the shallow metrics of the snob, why allow their judgment to deflate your ego? The ultimate freedom is realizing that you can consciously choose the reference group that dictates your self-esteem.
This has been such an incredible journey through the history of our own insecurities. We've seen how deeply systems shape what we believe about ourselves. By shifting our attention from individual insecurity to systemic design, we can finally see how heavily modern identity relies on social recognition, and how we can begin to take control of that narrative. Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.
I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over independently. We've discussed how, currently, our status is tightly bound to our economic utility and financial achievement. But what happens to human dignity in a near future, where sweeping automation and artificial intelligence make traditional merit and financial achievement obsolete for the vast majority of society? If human labor is no longer the primary engine of the economy, will we regress to ancient, violent forms of status? Or will this systemic shock force us to invent an entirely new, perhaps more humane currency of self-worth?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take
Yeah.
care of yourselves, and maybe just for today, choose a different audience.